It looked like an innocent portrait of a mother with her kids, until you zoomed in on their hands. Dr. Michael Harrison adjusted his desk lamp, illuminating the sepia-toned portrait he'd just scanned at 1200 dpi. As the town historian for Millbrook, Iowa, he digitized hundreds of old photographs for the municipal archives, but something about this particular image made him pause. The photograph showed a well-dressed woman seated in an ornate Victorian chair, flanked by two children. The studio backdrop featured painted columns and draped fabric, typical of early 1900s portrait photography. The woman wore a high-collared dress with intricate lace detailing, her hair styled in the Gibson girl fashion popular in 1905. The children stood rigidly beside her, a girl of about 14 in a white dress with puffed sleeves, and a boy of perhaps 12 in a dark suit with knee-length breeches. Michael leaned closer to his monitor, studying their faces. The mother's expression was stern, almost challenging, her jaw set with an unmistakable hardness. But it was the children's faces that troubled him. Their eyes held something he'd seen in countless historical photographs, that blank, distant stare that came from holding still for long exposures. Yet beneath that technical necessity, he detected something else. Fear? Resignation? He zoomed in on the girl's face. Emma, according to the faded inscription on the photograph's backing. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her shoulders hunched slightly inward, despite the photographer's obvious efforts to pose her properly. Then Michael noticed her hands. The girl's right hand rested on her mother's shoulder, while her left hung at her side. Even through the grain and damage of the century-old photograph, he could see dark marks circling her wrist, just visible where her sleeve had shifted slightly during the exposure. His breath caught. He zoomed in further, then shifted to the boy, Daniel, the inscription had read. The boy's hands were clasped in front of him, but there, on his left forearm where his sleeve had ridden up slightly, were more dark marks. Michael sat back in his chair, his pulse quickening. These weren't shadows. These weren't artifacts of aging photographic paper. These were bruises. Michael couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. He'd stayed at the archives until nearly midnight, examining every detail under different lighting conditions and magnifications. The marks were undeniable. Distinct patterns of discoloration on both children's exposed skin, exactly where fingers might grip too tightly. The next morning he returned to the basement storage room where he'd found the image. It had been part of a collection donated by the estate of Millbrook's oldest photography studio, which had closed in 1963. Among the boxes of glass plate negatives and deteriorating prints, Michael located the studio's business ledger, a massive leather-bound book with entries dating back to 1899. He found the entry within 20 minutes. November 14, 1905, portrait sitting. Mrs. Catherine Brennan and children. Full plate format. Payment, $350. Catherine Brennan. Now he had a name. Michael pulled out his laptop and began searching through digitized census records. The 1900 census showed Catherine Brennan, age 26, living on Maple Street with her husband, Thomas Brennan, a foreman at the lumber mill. No children listed yet. The 1910 census was more revealing. Catherine Brennan, now 36, head of household. Occupation, seamstress. Living with her were Emma Brennan, 19, and Daniel Brennan, 17. No husband listed. Thomas Brennan had disappeared from the records between 1900 and 1910. Michael's mind raced with possibilities. Divorce was scandalous but not impossible in 1905. Death was common. Industrial accidents, disease, any number of tragedies could have left Catherine a widow. But something about the timeline nagged at him. He pulled the original photograph from its protective sleeve and examined the back more carefully. Beneath the faded names and date, someone had written in different, shakier handwriting, "May God forgive us all." The words had been added years later, the ink a different shade, the hand that wrote them clearly aged or trembling. Michael photographed the inscription, then carefully returned the portrait to its sleeve. He needed to know more about the Brennan family. The marks on those children's wrists deserved an explanation, even after more than a century of silence. The Millbrook Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on 3rd Street. Michael knew that if anyone had personal accounts or letters from early residents, it would be archived there. Helen Martinez, the society's volunteer coordinator, greeted him warmly. At 78, she'd lived in Millbrook her entire life and knew the town's history better than anyone. "Catherine Brennan?" Helen repeated, her expression darkening slightly. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. My grandmother used to mention her." Michael's pulse quickened. Your grandmother knew her. Not personally, but they lived on the same street in the 1910s. Grandmother was just a girl then, but she remembered Mrs. Brennan clearly. Said she was a hard woman, kept to herself mostly. Helen paused, studying Michael's face. Why are you asking? Michael showed her the photograph on his tablet, zooming in on the children's wrists. Helen put on her reading glasses and leaned close. Her expression shifted from curiosity to something heavier. Recognition, perhaps, or sad confirmation of something she'd suspected. I need to show you something, she said quietly. Helen led Michael to a filing cabinet in the back room. She pulled out a folder labeled Personal Correspondence, Miller Family, 1900-1920. Inside were letters written by a woman named Grace Miller to her sister in Chicago. Grace Miller lived next door to the Brennans, Helen explained. She was quite the letter writer, very observant. Michael began reading. Most letters discussed mundane matters, weather, church socials, local gossip. Then he found an entry from December 1905. The Brennan children look poorly. Emma has taken to wearing long sleeves even indoors, despite the heat from the stove. Yesterday I saw young Daniel walking to school, and he moved as though his ribs pained him. Mrs. Brennan says they are clumsy children, always falling. But sister, I have raised 4 children of my own, and I know the difference between childish accidents and something darker. Michael read the passage 3 times. Did Grace ever do anything about it? Helen's expression was pained. Keep reading. Michael continued through Grace Miller's letters, his stomach tightening with each revelation. In March 1906, she wrote, I spoke to Reverend Patterson about my concerns regarding the Brennan children. He assured me that Mrs. Brennan is a God-fearing woman who attends services faithfully. He reminded me that children require firm discipline and that it is not our place to interfere in family matters. I feel I have failed them. The reality of the era became painfully clear. In 1905, children were considered the property of their parents. Corporal punishment was not only accepted but encouraged as proper child-rearing. The concept of child abuse as a crime didn't exist in any meaningful legal sense. Even well-meaning neighbors like Grace Miller had no authority, no agency, and no legal recourse to protect children they suspected were being harmed. Michael found a letter from July 1906 that made his hands shake. I encountered Emma Brennan at the general store yesterday. She is now 15 and has grown tall, but so terribly thin. When she reached for a bolt of fabric on a high shelf, her sleeve fell back. Sister, her forearm was covered in marks, some fresh, some faded to yellow. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw such profound sadness that I nearly wept. But what could I say? What can any of us do? He discovered that Grace had tried, in her limited way, to help. She began leaving baskets of food on the Brennan porch, claiming she'd overbaked. She offered Emma work doing simple sewing, paying her directly so the girl would have her own money. Small acts of kindness that could not address the fundamental horror of the children's situation. The most devastating letter came from November 1906. Mrs. Brennan discovered that I had given Emma $2 for hemming work. She appeared at my door in a fury, saying I was undermining her authority and teaching her children to be deceitful. She forbade Emma and Daniel from speaking to me or accepting anything from our household. Now when I see them on the street, they walk past with their eyes down, and my heart breaks anew. Michael closed the folder, feeling the weight of history's helplessness. Michael needed to understand what had happened to Thomas Brennan. A widowed mother in 1905 faced enormous economic pressure, and financial desperation could explain, though never excuse, Catherine's treatment of her children. He headed to the Millbrook Gazette's archives, housed in the library's climate-controlled basement. The newspaper had been publishing continuously since 1887, and every issue had been digitized. Michael searched for Thomas Brennan and found his answer in the October 12, 1904 edition. Tragic accident at Brennan Lumber Mill read the headline. The article described how Thomas Brennan, 30 years old, had been killed when a load of logs broke free from their chains and crushed him. The accident had occurred on October 8, 1904. He left behind a wife and 2 young children. Michael sat back, piecing together the timeline. Thomas died in October 1904. The photograph was taken in November 1905, just over a year later. The bruises on the children's wrists suggested the abuse had been ongoing for some time before the portrait was made. He found a follow-up article from October 1904 about Thomas's funeral. It mentioned that Catherine Brennan was overcome with grief and that the lumber mill's owner, Mr. Harrison, had started a fund to support the widow and her children. The community had rallied around the family in their time of loss. But something caught Michael's attention in a brief news item from June 1904, 4 months before Thomas's death. Thomas Brennan, foreman at Brennan Lumber Mill, appeared in court Monday regarding a dispute with mill owner Robert Harrison. The matter was settled privately, and no charges were filed. What kind of dispute? Michael searched for more information but found nothing. Court records from that era were spotty at best, and whatever had happened between Thomas and his employer had been resolved without leaving a detailed paper trail. He returned to the death notice. The article mentioned that Thomas's brother, James Brennan, had traveled from Des Moines to attend the funeral, but made no mention of James offering to help his widowed sister-in-law and niece and nephew. The isolation of Catherine and her children was becoming clearer. A widow struggling financially, cut off from extended family, bearing her burdens alone. Michael's next stop was the Millbrook School District's administrative office. School attendance records from the early 1900s were incomplete, but the district had preserved some teacher logs and report cards in their historical collection. The assistant superintendent, Patricia Chen, helped him search through boxes of fragile documents. They found Emma Brennan's records first, a thin file containing report cards from 1903 to 1908. The academic records were exceptional. Emma had received top marks in reading, writing, arithmetic, and deportment through 1904. Her teacher, Miss Sarah Whitmore, had written in September 1904, "Emma is a bright and diligent student who shows particular aptitude for composition. She would benefit from advanced studies if circumstances permit." But the records from 1905 onward told a different story. Emma's grades had dropped precipitously. By spring 1906, she was barely passing. More telling were the attendance records. Dozens of absences marked illness or family obligations. Michael found a note from Miss Whitmore dated March 1906, addressed to the school board. "I am concerned about Emma Brennan's continued absences and declining performance. On the occasions when she does attend school, she appears exhausted and withdrawn. I have attempted to speak with Mrs. Brennan about these concerns, but she insists Emma is needed at home to help with sewing work and that academic achievement is of secondary importance for a girl. I fear we are losing a promising student to circumstances beyond her control." Daniel's records were similar. The boy had been an average student through 1904, then began missing weeks of school at a time starting in early 1905. A teacher's note from October 1905 read, "Daniel Brennan returned to school today after a 3-week absence. He claimed he had been ill, but he flinched noticeably when I touched his shoulder to guide him to his seat. His explanations for his injuries are inconsistent and rehearsed." The final document in Daniel's file was a letter from the school principal to Catherine Brennan, dated May 1906. "Due to Daniel's continued absences and failure to complete required coursework, we must inform you that he will not be promoted to the next grade." There was no record of Catherine's response, but Daniel's attendance ceased entirely after that letter. Michael returned to the census records, this time looking for economic clues. The 1910 census listed Catherine's occupation as seamstress, with Emma also working as a seamstress's assistant. Daniel's occupation was listed as mill worker. At just 17 years old, he'd followed his dead father into the lumber industry. He found Catherine's business advertisements in the Millbrook Gazette classifieds. Starting in late 1904, small notices appeared weekly: fine sewing and alterations, Mrs. C. Brennan, reasonable rates, Maple Street. Michael cross-referenced these advertisements with the town's economic records. The lumber mill had reduced wages in 1905 due to a regional economic downturn. Prices for basic goods had risen while working families' incomes stagnated. For a widow trying to support 2 children on sewing income alone, the financial pressure would have been crushing. He found a record of Catherine applying for charitable assistance from the Ladies' Aid Society in January 1905. The application had been denied. The Society's notes indicated that Catherine was capable of working, and that assistance should be reserved for those who were elderly or infirm. In the Historical Society's collection, Michael discovered something that made the picture even clearer: a ledger from Thornton's General Store showing the Brennan family's account. Starting in November 1904, shortly after Thomas's death, Catherine had begun buying on credit. By 1906, she owed the store $47.35, equivalent to roughly 3 months of her sewing income. The economic desperation was real and documented, but Michael knew that poverty, while it might explain stress and hardship, could never justify what those bruises represented. Thousands of families faced similar struggles in early 1900s America. Most didn't leave marks on their children's wrists. He found one more document that shifted his understanding, a property record showing that Catherine had sold the family's house on Maple Street in August 1907. The sale price was $380, and the buyer was Robert Harrison, the lumber mill owner who had employed Thomas. After the sale, the Brennan family disappeared from Millbrook's records entirely. Michael spent 2 weeks searching for any trace of where the Brennans had gone after leaving Millbrook in 1907. He searched census records in neighboring counties, checked passenger manifests for trains heading to larger cities, and contacted historical societies throughout Iowa and neighboring states. He found nothing until he expanded his search to Illinois. In the 1920 census for Chicago, he discovered an Emma Brennan, age 29, working as a schoolteacher. The age matched perfectly. She was listed as unmarried, living in a boarding house on the south side. Could this be the same girl from the photograph? The child with bruises on her wrists, now a teacher herself? Michael contacted the Chicago Board of Education's archives. They had employment records going back to the 1890s. After 3 days, an archivist named Jennifer Williams emailed him a scanned file. Emma Brennan had been hired by Chicago Public Schools in September 1918. Her employment application included a brief autobiographical statement required of all teachers at the time. Michael's hands trembled as he read it. "I was born in Millbrook, Iowa, in 1891. My father died when I was 13, and my family faced significant hardship afterward. I left Iowa at 16 to work as a domestic servant in Chicago, saving money to continue my education. I attended night school while working during the day and earned my teaching certificate from Chicago Normal College in 1917. I am dedicated to ensuring that all children, particularly those facing difficult home circumstances, have access to education and support." The carefully chosen words spoke volumes. Emma had escaped at 16, likely running away from her mother's house. She had survived, educated herself, and dedicated her life to helping children. Michael found Emma's name in Chicago newspapers from the 1920s and 1930s. She had become known as an advocate for students from impoverished families, often paying for their school supplies from her own salary. She had never married. She had retired in 1956 and died in 1962 at age 71. But what about Daniel? Michael searched for hours but found no definitive trace of him after the family left Millbrook. Michael was about to give up on finding Daniel when he received an unexpected email. Jennifer Williams, the Chicago archivist, had continued searching on her own time. She'd found something. "There's a death certificate from 1915, she wrote. "Daniel Brennan, age 22, died in Chicago on March 3, 1915. Cause of death listed as complications from pneumonia, but here's what made me think this might be your Daniel." The informant who provided information for the death certificate was Emma Brennan, listed as his sister. The address she gave was the same South Side boarding house where she was living. Michael's heart sank. Daniel had died at 22, just 8 years after leaving Millbrook. He requested the full death certificate and hospital records if any existed. The records arrived a week later. Daniel had been admitted to Cook County Hospital on February 28, 1915, suffering from advanced pneumonia. The attending physician's notes mentioned patient's generally weakened condition and evidence of past physical trauma, including poorly healed rib fractures. The injuries from childhood had left their mark, literally, on Daniel's body. Whether those old fractures had contributed to his vulnerability to illness was impossible to prove, but the connection was heartbreaking. Emma had been with him when he died. The hospital records showed she'd visited daily during his 5-day hospitalization, and she'd arranged for his burial in a modest cemetery on Chicago's west side. Michael found one more document, a brief obituary Emma had paid to have published in a small Chicago neighborhood newspaper. "Daniel Brennan, beloved brother and friend, has passed at age 22. He survived hardships that would have broken lesser souls and brought kindness to all who knew him. He will be deeply missed." Service is private. The careful phrasing again. Survived hardships that would have broken lesser souls. Emma had spent her life protecting her brother's dignity, even in death, by keeping the details of their childhood private. Michael now knew what had happened to both children. But what about Catherine? Had Emma maintained contact with her mother after leaving Millbrook? Or had the escape meant severing that relationship entirely? Michael's final discovery came from an unexpected source. While researching Emma Brennan's teaching career, he found a 1958 interview she'd given to a Chicago Teacher's Journal about her work with disadvantaged students. Near the end of the interview, the journalist had asked Emma about her own educational journey. Her response was the most direct acknowledgement of her past that Michael had found. "I came from circumstances where education was not valued, where children were seen as economic assets rather than individuals with potential. I was fortunate to escape that environment, though my brother was not as lucky. He died young, carrying wounds that never fully healed, not just physical wounds, but deeper ones that poverty and cruelty inflict on a child's spirit. I became a teacher because I wanted to be the person I needed when I was young, someone who looked closely enough to see when a child was suffering and who cared enough to help." The journalist had asked if Emma maintained contact with her family in Iowa. Her reply was brief. "My mother died in 1918. We had not spoken in many years. Some doors, once closed, cannot be reopened." Michael searched for Catherine's death record and found it in a Chicago pauper's cemetery registry. She had died alone in a charity hospital at age 44, with no family present. Emma had not claimed the body. There had been no funeral, no obituary, no mourning. Michael looked again at the 1905 photograph that had started his investigation. He understood now what he was seeing. Not just bruises captured accidentally by a photographer's camera, but evidence of suffering that two children had endured, survived, and ultimately escaped. Emma had lived 54 years after that photograph was taken. She had transformed her pain into purpose, helping hundreds of students over her 40-year teaching career. She had honored her brother's memory by dedicating herself to protecting other children from the kinds of wounds they had both carried. The photograph had kept its terrible secret for 119 years. Now finally, it could serve as a witness to what those children had survived, and as a reminder that someone who looks closely, who cares enough to zoom in and see what others miss, might be the difference between a child's suffering continuing in silence or finally being seen, acknowledged, and stopped. Michael added his research to the municipal archives, ensuring that Emma and Daniel's story would be preserved. The photograph remained in its protective sleeve, but now it was accompanied by the full context of what those bruises represented, and the remarkable resilience of the girl who had worn them, escaped, and built a life dedicated to ensuring other children would not suffer as she had.